Good morning, everyone. Robin Urbach is writing August 20th. Today's the 22nd. Trudeau's decision to prorogue Parliament now just as cynical and self-serving as Harper's was. The main difference is that the Liberals have the hubris to pretend it's not. Right, and the line that the Liberals are taking is we have to do this to reset. Never mind the contempt for Parliament for not delivering a budget. Never mind all of the other related scandals. And there are a lot of related scandals from SNC and Jody Wilson-Raybould to Mark Norman to currently We and then the rent scandal, and I'm going to get to We and the rent scandal, and many other scandals that this Liberal government has presided over. I don't know what's going to be enough because come the throne speech on September 23rd, the NDP have to decide if they support the government and want to continue to wield their balance of power, however which way they want to wield it. And usually you wield a balance of power to push for reforms that you want. But the Liberals and the NDP seem to be pretty well aligned, right? So it's a really hard thing to, expect the NDP to bring the government down. The government that's obviously crony, obviously corrupt, obviously lying a lot. And yet, it's probably better for the NDP if they don't run an election, right? But they probably should drop this government because of all of the scandals. And however, as I said, Harper prorogued twice. So how many more proroguings do we have before this government's out of them, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know if the NDP can justify to it themselves and to their base supporting this Liberal government. If they feel like they can, then I think they will. And if they feel like there's pressure, then I think they won't. But I don't think they're going to feel like there's pressure. I think that the Greens, the NDP, and the Liberals feel like what's going on is exactly what should be going on. And that's scary considering how shockingly bad the policies are. And here's it's not just my words, and this is just one example, but this is the end of the show today, but new EI program will be a disaster for Canada and our youth. And there's a bunch of other critiques on the EI program that's supposed to be replacing CERB. But fundamentally, it is scandal after scandal, bad policy after bad policy, and how many votes can you just buy by pretending socialism will work at some point? Because it runs out, right? It runs out, and I think you'll understand why when I go through this. But here we go. Here's Trudeau trying to use his platform. Yesterday they were at 3M. He was with Doug Ford announcing masks. And you guys know my feelings on masks. I feel like the numbers don't bear out the continued lockdown. The numbers don't bear the need for masks in schools. The numbers don't bear the need for mandatory masking at all. And yet, they're trying to play this as a big win. And I think that they're surprised by the lack of enthusiasm. I went on to there's a 3M tweet, and I didn't get it. But they had like 60 likes from yesterday. And I mean, like, that's supposed to be a big announcement. I feel like the general public is kind of just waiting for the government to realize that this is over. And I think a lot of the hype currently is being pushed by the unions. Well, I hate to tell you, daycares have been back for more than a month. My son's been in daycare for most of the summer, and it's been fine. There's been no problems. And no problems in that nobody's been sick. No problems in that anything's been cumbersome or difficult. So it's been really interesting watching the Upper Grand District School Board and other school boards, Toronto District School Board, release things claiming like this is unprecedented and we've never seen anything like this and all sorts of stuff. I've never seen a school closed from a bad flu. Like, and the numbers again just don't bear out that this is much worse. Right? So, okay, here's Justin Trudeau using his platform to diminish the proroguing as something that's not important, certainly less important than 3M masks. This is kind of funny. Here we go. I'm going to skip the first part of the question, but here we go.
In regards to your other questions, now remembering, sorry, can you remind me what they were? It's about something far less important than N95 masks, I suspect.
Do you stand by the original statement that you first heard about the rollout of the program
thank you.
on May 8th?
Yes.
As well as the scandal that had anything to do with Mr. Monod's resignation.
Yes.
Thank you.
As I said,
I apologize. He's not defending the proroguing. He's defending the his testimony from and that yes, he maintains that what was said. What he testified to was true, despite the documents coming out and and casting doubt on that. So, I mean, that was interesting. So I apologize for saying that he was defending the proroguing. He wasn't. He also, at the end of the clip, says that he wishes Morneau the best in his future endeavors, which is he's trying to become the head of the OECD. So, yeah, an international body that spends taxpayer money. He's good at that. Right? He's good at that. Here's the keys to the car, boss. I crashed it, but it's okay. Here's the keys. See you later. SNC-Lavalin. Moving on, has landed more than 100 government contracts since Trudeau's ethics controversy. Isn't that nice? I remember being upset about because I knew they were going to get a DPA. DPA is a deferred prosecution agreement. Means that basically they get a slap on the wrist and they have to pay a fine and they can continue doing business because maybe some people broke the law, but that shouldn't bring the whole company down, basically, is the idea, right? There's people's jobs at stake here, right? But close your businesses because there's 10 people in the hospital, 8 people in the hospital, 6 people in the hospital. SNC-Lavalin has landed more than 100 government contracts since Trudeau's ethics controversy. Lavalin, the company that landed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in trouble with the ethics commissioner, has been awarded more than 100 government contracts since the controversy. According to a database from open source, SNC-Lavalin received 142 government contracts with a combined worth of about $25 million between January and June 2020, January 2019 and June 2020. Aaron Werdick, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, said he was shocked SNC-Lavalin was continuing to receive government contracts. I think from SNC-Lavalin's standpoint, these are not giant contracts, said Werdick. They often deal with contracts that are much larger, so this is small potatoes for them. But I think that a lot of Canadians would be surprised to know that they're active in bidding after the seriousness of what happened last year. In August of last year, Mario Dion, the ethics commissioner, found Trudeau guilty of breaching ethics rules by trying to persuade his attorney general to give SNC-Lavalin a deferred prosecution agreement in relation to criminal charges it was facing. And we remember that story, right? Everybody said there was no pressure, there was no improper pressure, and then we found out there was improper pressure, and he broke ethics laws, and blah, 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 and he said he was sorry, and then we all learned from it, and, the usual Trudeau patter, right? It's the same thing all the time. Here's the CBC, and they're reporting BC law enforcement officers are authorized to issue $2,000 fines for hosting large events. If people are back to having large events, and I've seen pictures recently of people in Wuhan at like pool parties and having like big concerts and things, no masks anywhere. Everybody's just having, a regular old party, which is wonderful for them. I'm glad that things are back to normal. It begs the question, what? It's when you need to use the encouragement of the law to enforce these rules, then people don't believe. Like, do you remember at the beginning of the lockdown, everybody was clapping at 7:00 for the healthcare workers and then going back into their house like dutiful Canadians, right? Because everybody saw the images coming out of Japan and didn't want people collapsing on the street and having seizures here, right? That's basically what it boiled down to. And then as time went on, and that didn't happen in the West, and as time went on, and the asymptomatic contagion has been questioned multiple times by the WHO as, we don't think that actually happens. And they've been asked to walk it back more than one time because people, not because of data, but because of outrage from people who say that they don't have the data to support saying that it doesn't have asymptomatic spread. But I don't know if they have that now. But twice now I've heard that the WHO has come out on separate occasions and said that asymptomatic spread is less than 15%, and maybe even less than that. So if that's true, we don't need masks. But these laws used to stop people gathering, it's just another removal of the freedoms that we are supposed to enjoy. Here's another removal of the freedoms that we're supposed to enjoy. Innocent until proven guilty, right? Or innocent until even suspicion of guilt, or guilty without any kind of suspicion, right? You have to prove your innocence here. Saskatchewan judge rules roadside breath test allowed without any suspicion is constitutional. Whoa, wonderful. Throw your constitution out the window. Now, I do have the constitution here. And number 1, section 1 in the rights and charter, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it says the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And number 8, hold on, I highlighted it. Hold on, legal. Here it is, number 8, legal rights. It says everyone has a right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. And under 11, it says you have a right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty to law in a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. So here's the Saskatchewan interpretation. A Saskatchewan judge has ruled that a new law allowing police to demand a roadside breath test from any driver without needing suspicion of drinking is constitutional. This appears to be the first ruling on a charter challenge of mandatory breath screening, federal legislation that was passed by the Liberal government and took effect in December 2018. Prior to the new law, police require some reason, such as slurred speech, bad driving, or the odor of alcohol, to demand that a driver take a breath test. The ruling was made in the lower court. The ruling was made in a lower provincial court, meaning it is not binding on other cases, but will likely be taken into consideration. Judge Morris Baniak, excuse me if I got that wrong, found that mandatory screening violates the Charter's Section 8, which protects against unreasonable search and seizure. However, Baniak concluded that the violation is acceptable under the Charter's Section 1, which allows for limited charter violations if they can be justified in a free and democratic society. I don't think that that's the interpretation that number 1 calls for. Like, that's not what I read. That's not what I read there. The Canadian Charter guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a law guy, but I don't read that it can be taught. I think that the basics of unreasonable search and seizure is that you get to be presumed innocent until there's a reason for suspicion of your guilt, right? And there's no reason for suspicion if an officer can pull you over and say, lovely afternoon, eh? Here's a breathalyzer. Please breathe into that. And if you say no, then you've committed an offense as well, right? So it's like you don't have rights. There's zero rights in this, because how is that reasonable in a fair and democratic, in a free and democratic society? I don't like it. I think that it's faulty, and it's very concerning when judges are casually saying, yeah, that's reasonable in our society, so that doesn't count. Your rights are less important than my whims at this point in time. Moving on. Feds to appeal ruling that struck down the Safe Third Country Agreement. A little while ago, and the article goes through this, but a little while ago there was a ruling that said the Safe Third Country Agreement was invalid because it was violating the human rights of the refugees who were trying to claim asylum in Canada, because sending them back to the United States violates their rights because they could be subject to imprisonment if they don't qualify. So the Canadian government is appealing it. So that's good, I think. Here's the article. Ottawa is appealing a court ruling that struck down a key refugee agreement between Canada and the United States, Public Safety Minister Bill Blair said Friday. The Federal Court of Canada ruled last month that elements of the law underpinning the pact violate the constitutional guarantee of life, liberty, and security. The declaration of invalidity was suspended for 6 months, leaving the law in place until mid-January. I like how they can use the Constitution, the Charter, right? It's the same thing here, and twist it to say whatever they want, right? And people read it and interpret it in what way they like. So the Charter purposely doesn't say Canadians, right? It says people, human people, right? And every citizen of Canada. Okay, well, there you go. So this everyone is the one that I was talking about. Everyone has the fundamental freedoms of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. So they're trying to use that everyone language. They're trying to use the generalization in the Charter to include anybody who is in Canada, like people, humans. That's part of the way they justify the use of the Charter, right? The Charter applies to anybody in Canada. Bam, done. Regardless of whether they're a Canadian citizen or not. And And sometimes people say that it applies to everyone in the world, right? Everyone in the world has this applied to them. No, I think that that's faulty. I think that the thought process there is faulty. But there are legal people who are using legal decisions as a basis for their legal decision, and that's how it's been interpreted. And I don't know. Okay. The declaration of invalidity was suspended 6 months, leaving the law in place until mid-January. I don't know if the appeal by the government will kick that further down. So if it'll keep the status quo in place until after the appeal, I would likely think so, but who knows? Under the Safe Third Country Agreement, which took effect in 2004, Canada and the U.S. recognize each other as a safe place for potential refugees to seek protection. It means Canada can turn back asylum seekers who arrive at land ports of entry along the Canada-U.S. border on the basis that they must pursue their claims in the U.S., the country where they first arrived. Potential refugees arriving from the U.S. by air, by sea, or between land ports, however, are eligible to have their claims referred to Canadian officials. The exception has spurred the arrival of thousands of people in Canada through unofficial border crossings, including the one between New York State and Quebec in recent years. I wonder why they don't use Roxham Road there, right? Because they don't want it showing up in searches. They don't want to reference it and have it showing up, having more hits in searches. Back to this. In a statement Friday, Blair said there are factual and legal errors in some of the federal court's key findings. There are important legal principles to be determined in this case, and it's the responsibility of the government of Canada to appeal to ensure clarity on the legal framework governing asylum law, he said. I scroll down. They have some case examples, and the specifics don't matter, but the generalities do. So here, talking about that. They argued in court that by returning ineligible refugees claimants to the U.S., Canada exposes them to risks in the form of detention and other rights violations. In her decision, Federal Court Justice Anne Marie McDonald concluded that the Safe Third Country Agreement results in ineligible claimants being imprisoned by U.S. authorities. Detention and the consequences flowing from it are inconsistent with the spirit and objective of the refugee agreement and amount to a violation of the rights guaranteed by Section 7 of the Charter, she wrote. The evidence clearly demonstrates that those returned to the U.S. by Canadian officials are detained as a penalty. As a penalty? Upon release of the ruling, public interest parties who took part in the case swiftly called on the federal government not to appeal the court decision and to stop sending people back to the U.S. under the agreement. In his statement, Blair said the agreement with the U.S. remains a comprehensive vehicle to uphold compassionate, fair, and orderly refugee protection system based on the principle that people should claim asylum in the first country in which they arrive. Conservative immigration critic Peter Kent noted Friday his party has been calling on the government to close the long-standing loopholes in the Safe Third Country Agreement. While we are pleased the government has decided to appeal this ruling, Canadians' confidence in the immigration system has been rocked by years of Justin Trudeau's failure to address these concerns and his failure to restore integrity and compassion to the immigration process, Kent said in a statement. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's no reasonable person who can argue the United States is not a safe place, except maybe people who live in Portland and the places where Antifa is being allowed to run amok by the Democratic leadership. And that's just a fact. I mean, it's unbelievable what they're allowing to happen in those cities. I would be very, very upset if that garbage started to happen in Canada. And I've seen it happen in Canada, but not nearly to the extent that Portland is having it specifically right now. So, yeah, I mean, rule of law is a thing, right? Like, these loopholes, they're not helpful to people. When you have loopholes and you turn a blind eye, you incentivize the loophole, right? It's valuable, and people will take advantage of it. It's frustrating. Okay, here is Pundit Class, and he says, remember when Jody Wilson-Raybould told a similar story? This is Justin Ling, and he said Bill Morneau's office told Rob Silver that his push to change the Canadian emergency wage subsidy to benefit MCAP, his employer, was inappropriate, but she kept pushing. So there's a Vice article. I'm not going to use the Vice article, but this Justin Ling is another... He was involved in the outing of We as a problematic group and with Canada Land, right? And he says Bill Morneau's office. So I just read that. Yes, this is the Vice article, and here's the National Post article. Right, there's Mr. Silver. And Rob Silver, husband of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, repeatedly pushed the Trudeau government to make changes to the federal wage subsidy in a failed bid to make his new employer eligible for the multi-billion-dollar aid program. According to two sources with knowledge of the situation, Silver's senior vice president, strategy, policy, risk at a private mortgage company, MCAP, approached ex-finance minister Bill Morneau's office in April asking for legislative changes to the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, CEWS, Vice News first reported the story on Friday. In his dealings with Morneau's office, Silver, who is not a registered lobbyist and whose wife Katie Telford has worked as Trudeau's chief of staff since 2015, even went so far as to suggest a specific wording for the legislative change he was seeking, according to one source. The legislative amendment was suggested would have benefited very few organizations other than MCAP, both sources confirm. The same sources said the request was quickly turned down by Morneau's office, but the ex-finance minister staff was very uncomfortable with Silver's contacts, knowing full well that he is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's chief of staff's husband. In a statement, the spokesman for MCAP did not deny any of the details, but insisted any interactions were done with respect to federal lobbying laws. MCAP, through counsel, consulted with Canada's lobbying commissioner in January to establish proper screens and protocols around any engagement with government. MCAP and its employees and officers have strictly complied with the letter and spirit of this guidance and all applicable laws, an MCAP spokesperson responded by email. The Prime Minister's office said Telford was not involved with any discussions involving MCAP. I want to note here, I went through what the ethics office and what the lobbying commissioner and everything. I don't know about the lobbying commissioner, but basically when they asked about an ethics screen, they said, yeah, you don't need an ethics screen. It's fine. No problems. Don't worry about it. You don't have to do anything. So if they are saying they complied with that, they didn't have to do anything. Okay. The Prime Minister's office said Telford was not involved in any discussions involving MCAP. Despite Silver's failed bid, the company did receive an $86 million contract to manage the government's commercial rent assistance program for small businesses only a few weeks later. The government said that neither Silver nor Telford had anything to do with that decision. Whew. Lucky, eh? Lucky. Okay, so this is the last story. Second last story, but this is the last big story. And yeah, I'm already long, so sorry about that. Brian Lilly says, I've been saying the Liberal plan is to bring in a federal universal basic income. I'm not alone. See this tweet from David Aiken quoting Scotiabank. And here's David Aiken. And he says, Scotiabank's VP and economist Derek Holt says Tuesday, CERB and EI changes, right? And so this is the problem with it. He says greater support for people who were hit by this pandemic through no fault of their own has merit. It's not costless, however, and there are long-term ramifications to diving deeper into programs with no apparent exit signals. Consider the math. Under revamped rules, one now only has to work just over 3 weeks over the past year in order to qualify for EI payments of $400 per week for at least 6 months. You don't even lose it all if you get a job. That translates into the annualized equivalent of about $21,000 or more. That might not seem like much, but it's going to be a problematic source of competition for workers in the hospitality, tourism, and seasonal sector of the economy, among others. Further, as, say, Ontario's minimum wages rise to $14.75 an hour this October, the incremental reward to slogging it to work at this wage for the 37.5 hours per week that sets a mythical full-time benchmark versus claiming what we are now more generous jobless benefit is about an extra $150 per week and possibly less than that. The degree to which these programs are multiplying and becoming permanent may also be construed as a backdoor towards a living wage or permanent income benefit, so UBI basically. Here's Dan Kelly, and he says an employee working 3 hours a week or 3.5 weeks of full-time over the past year will now qualify for $10,000 in special EI benefits, the new CERB, if they don't work. It appears they can simply refuse to return to their pre-COVID job with no consequences. So the high school student who used to working 1 3-hour shift per week at $15 per hour has the choice of $45 a week if working or $400 per week on EI. I have no issue with generous ongoing support for those who do not have a job to return to due to COVID-19, but why would we replace more than 100% of one's pre-COVID income? If you were used to earning $45 a week for working 3 hours a week, why would you get $400? Makes perfect sense. And that's why the policies are bad. New EI program will be a disaster for Canada and our youth. When Dan Kelly was in grade 9 back in 1983, the now president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, I believe this is Dan Kelly here. This is the guy here. So, the work 3 hours every Friday night washing dishes at a Winnipeg pizza restaurant. Changes announced Thursday by Canada's new finance minister Chrystia Freeland and Minister of Employment Carla Quattro would make young workers similar to Kelly all those years ago eligible to collect employment insurance benefits for 6 months after only working 120 hours or 40 Friday nights in Kelly's case. The ministers also announced that they were extending the CERB, C-E-R-B, for 4 more weeks to give government time to revamp the employment insurance program to allow more Canadians to receive financial aid during COVID-19. Every day I hear from worried business owners that they're having troubles competing with CERB to get workers, said Kelly, whose organization represents small business owners who employ 60% of working Canadians. But the EI changes that they're making, in fact, make it even more worrisome in some respects because they're lowering the bar to only 120 hours of work to collect a minimum of $400 a week for 26 weeks. That's just 3 weeks of work to collect 6 months of EI. Or imagine someone working for $15 an hour for 120 hours who would make $1,800. What incentive will they have to continue working if they can collect $10,000 over the next 6 months? Very little, says Kelly. You don't have to be a renowned economist to recognize the dangers to society and the negative effects to the country's bottom line this plan could cause. But let's consult one anyway. Jack Mintz, president and fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, called the changes really, really bad policy with all kinds of disastrous unintended consequences. The federal liberals do not care about how much anything costs, and it shows, says Mintz, who was reached in Toronto. I scroll down. When you make it too easy, it's not good for society, said Mintz. Maybe this is their way of moving towards a guaranteed annual income. That's 3. Mintz points out that the CERB doesn't discriminate between full and part-time work, so I could be working 10 hours a week and get the same payment, $2,000 a month, as someone who is working full-time. No wonder people don't want to go back to work. Mintz says he has heard from numerous business owners that some of their employees are indicating they'll only go back to work until their pay reaches $995 in any given month, so they can keep on receiving the CERB, which stops being paid to people who make more than $1,000 per month. People forget we're going to have deficits next year and the year after, and people do not realize the hole that we're digging and the fact that we're going to be making the economic recovery that much harder to do with the way things are going right now, said Mintz. Christian Thomas, a 23-year-old who works for the chartered bank in Toronto, and for the purpose of full disclosure, a friend of my son's, said he was getting twice weekly physiotherapy sessions via Skype for a strained MCL on his right knee. Towards the end of May, his physiotherapist asked him to delay paying his bill for 5 days. Thomas asked why, and the physiotherapist said it was because it would put him over the $1,000 he's allowed to earn in order to continue collecting CERB. Thomas says he was sympathetic at first since he knows the therapist was not working as much as usual as a result of government-mandated COVID-19 restrictions. But since then, he's heard troubling stories about people gaming the system to collect CERB while working just enough before hitting the CERB cutoff. He's heard stories of people collecting CERB while in Bermuda and others working just enough and then calling in sick so they can keep collecting the CERB. Mintz also said he's heard from numerous business owners that they're working 12-hour days in their coffee shop or other small businesses because they can't find people willing to work thanks to the CERB. So, bad policy. Really, really bad policy. I'll leave this story just to say, well, I'll just leave it as a tweet. TD Bank ordered to pay $122 million for overdraft enrollment practices, U.S. agency. So this is the third bank story in as many days that has had them paying millions of dollars because of bad practices or whatever, as held accountable in the U.S. So very interesting trend happening. The bad policies, the continued scandals. I don't know how much longer this government has to last, but it seems like all of that depends on the NDP. The scandals, not that the scandals don't stick, but being held accountable requires the House to vote more on what's happened in the House and not on election readiness. That said, I don't know that we're at the point where, I mean, Kathleen Wynne was toxic to the brand. Everybody disliked Kathleen Wynne. Everybody knew the Liberals wouldn't win. I have no idea who'd win the next election. Oh, and I haven't even talked about the CPC leadership race. Excuse me. The leadership race happened yesterday. The votes all are in, and the winner will be announced on Sunday, announced tomorrow. So they've got today to sweat it out. Yay? I don't know. I haven't even looked at the counting room feed. I'll have a look at that after this, I think. But yeah, I mean, if it's Peter MacKay, good luck. That's back to a Trudeau minority, probably, with balance of power being the same as it is now. So just a nightmare, because they'll take that as confirmation that people are okay with what they're doing, and they'll double down on this UBI garbage. And I don't know how you fight that. There's nothing that can fight that. If the leader, if it's Lewis, then you've got a shot. O'Toole, maybe, but I don't know that O'Toole's better. He's certainly not better than Scheer. He's Kanzuk. He's basically liberal light, like the epitome of liberal light, right? It's basically Scheer, another Scheer. So if it's O'Toole, toss up for the next election. If it's Leslyn Lewis, I think she wins. I think she takes Trudeau down. But I don't know. And I don't know how the other parties play into that if it's Lewis. So because their usual tactic won't work. And I'm sure they've got something else up their sleeve. But all of that said, I think Lewis is probably the best candidate in the CPC race, and it's a terrible party that is terrible. And I don't trust them, not one little bit. I think it's going to be Peter MacKay. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Check out CanadaPoly.com, check out CanadaReport.co, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Why would I trust the CPC now? I mean, they haven't done anything that showed Pierre Poilievre. That's it. I would trust him. I wouldn't trust anybody else. Okay, have a wonderful day.